Awa. Ichi.
1
Ichi. 1. Oh, interesting. What's the kanji for ichi? Is it just 1 dash? Umi. What's the kanji for 1? Ichi? Ichi? Is it just a dash? That's so good. Because we just talked about 3. Yeah, it's the same as Mandarin. I'm like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I'm like looking at this like ichi. What the heck, dude? Yeah, I would definitely prefer the kanji over ichi. Sorry. Okay. Umi. Shimi.
しみ air
Just what are the few moments? Okay.
air
Yeah.
air air air
Yeah. Okay.
え
Uh.
あ
Air. Yeah. Okay.
わし
Or he, depending on the situation. Yeah. I can imagine that. I can imagine there are different situations. You know what I have to say about that? 1 and he. What is an English? What's an English equivalent of that? Depending on the situation. A lot of people say like, oh yeah, but it's expressing the same thing. Yeah. Well, Japanese have situational. So does English. When you say 1 instead of singular, or 1 or single, a lot of times English people would say, well, 1 and single are synonyms. It's like, yeah, if you want to generalize it in a lower if you don't have the appropriateness, right? So you could interchangeably use 1 and singular, but I'm gonna tell you now, one word means a different context than another word. So there's a different emphasis on the word single versus the word 1, the number 1, right? So it's kind of fun drawing these parallelisms now. And so the more you guys tell me that there are alternatives, the more I feel like Japanese is getting a little bit more feels parallel to English. I really do hope that's the case, because it's kind of restrictive right now. I like playing around with words. It's one of my favorite things about English. So hopefully I will get to a point where I could play around a little bit with Japanese. Probably not as flexible as English, but still, yeah. Oftentimes when you're talking about, for example, some people don't think it's pragmatic to understand that 1 and single are situational use. So when you're talking about math, you would use 1. When you talk about things or objects, you would it is more appropriate to use the word single or singular, because when you use 1, there are times when people want the imagery of using 1 as in the number. Japanese has counters, so do English. It's just not the same. It's like not the same techniques. You don't use the same like ways to have different counters. That's the nice thing about getting to know a language, right? And a lot of times when I hear all the people stating the differences, well, there are similarities too. There are parallels as well, just very different parallels. Where was I? Washi. Give me an example of a counter. Give me an example of counters. Like, what do you mean by counters? This is where the English comes in kind of fun because counters can mean different things. Got my pen, so I gotta go find it. Dang it, my pen's gone. Okay, I found it. Okay. I believe all the kanjis are same in Japanese and Mandarin. They just say them differently. Oh, wait. Like in Cantonese, one person is Igaran. Igaran. Ga is a counter. Your phone died? Sorry to hear that, Milo. Did you charge it? I believe all the kanji are the same in Japanese and Mandarin. Yeah, so here's my take on counters. One single person. Or you could say, in context, individual. So instead of saying one single person, it is captured in the meaning of individual. One pair of persons. I mean, it doesn't count up very high, but one pair of, well, actually now it gets a little complicated because you could have two pairs of people or one set, and you can actually literally say one count of people. You just add the extra modifier in, or you turn it into like a group. It's not, I'm not going to say it's a literal thing. I'm just saying the act and expression can be, it's not a loss in translation sometimes. Not as. You say nobody say one count of people. One. And when I say count, I'm talking about your counters. So you say one group of people. Group is a count of people. One set of people. Like, there's interchangeable words for the way things are counted. And I'm using the count as a placeholder. One flock of birds. It's a different count. That's, you could also say, like, you want it to be literal. The word set has the most definitions? What do you mean by the word set has the most definitions? Oh, you mean that it's okay. But what you're trying to express is, so when you say counters, right? So in Mandarin, You're expressing the idea that the number as a unit. That's at least my take on what they're trying to express. It's a number unit, as in it describes the number, the type of number it is. And in English, you use units, and units come with all things. So like an example of units is like meters, right? And like distances. That's in science, these would be considered unit labels for the number of counting. So like numbers don't mean anything without their units. Like what I mean is, you could say 1 is always going to be a singular what. So English needs a descriptor, which I call these counters. Because you need to define what the number means. The number needs a definition. So you cannot use 1 and then leave anything. It doesn't mean anything yet. There's no meaning. And in Mandarin, the idea of having counters, at least for me in Mandarin, is to ascribe an additional meaning to whatever the context is. So if you're counting like one person, you need a counter to go with the person. I don't know if that's how it works in Japanese, so I could be totally way off base here in Japanese. But the idea is it's placing a counter, a type of unit, to the number. And this thing, what I'm saying here, is something that when someone's not in science, someone that's not in science is often lost. It's to be more specific about the number, yes. So when you're talking about counters, it is offering more detail about a number. And I totally get it. No one, I do agree with you, Victor. Like, it does feel like no one does this in English. No one does this in English. And this is where the whole, like, my snobbery comes in. In science, whenever I see 1, 2, 3, when people are counting, these numbers are inferred. Like they're usually inferred by context. And one thing that science has to, when you're writing in science, you have to identify what that number means. So you have to, what I would call, ascribe a type of counter, but really I'm referring to units. You need to give a number units. So a lot of times when people are in conversation, they would say, there are 4. There are 4 of what? Like, I don't understand. It's like, well, there are 4 inferred whatever you were talking about. So you could put people. All right, well, what kind of people? Short people? Tall people? But lots of times, this is the normal thing. So no one uses a counter-based thing, right? Like, they're not really counting, like, short and tall. You only get short and tall. But instead, you could put in, like, a unit. Like 176 centimeter people. 4 170 centimeter people. Or something. And science tends to focus on using units, and that's what I think is parallel to that. I'm not sure if the same meaning is the same, but it's the closest thing that I can think of to English. And I actually think people don't do this very often. So I agree with you. I agree with you that no one, or it feels like no one, is specific about their numbers. And that's kind of a thing that I have. It's not a pet peeve of me. I always ask the follow-up question. So when someone says, oh, I just got 100%, right? 100%. And my first question is 100% of what? Like, there's no, this doesn't tell me anything. 100% of what? It doesn't mean anything to me yet. Oh, I got 100% completion. That still doesn't help. Completion of what? So that's kind of the closest thing I can say. It's not the best idea. It's not the best example, but hopefully maybe that's you could meet me halfway here. And I totally agree with you though. No one says these things. Like no one ever specifies like one individual. They would probably say one person. Right? It would be like saying one whole person. Yeah, one whole person. Right? One whole person. Exactly. One whole person. And I totally agree with you in that. I totally agree with you that you wouldn't infer this for the most part. There are situations that you do have to. So in science, when you're describing one whole object, in my opinion, you're describing that you're rounding an object. So when is this useful? Is what you're saying is you're counting only whole objects. You're not counting fragments of objects. Because if you count fragments of objects, there are probably going to be more fragments than whole objects. Or like one whole, or say one whole number. One whole number. Guess what? Whole numbers are a thing in math because they're different from one decimal or one fraction. So we have separate words. We have separate English words instead of using modifiers to determine what is the lowest thing we're counting. Yeah. So it's not that important. I think it's not that important. But we do have something. I would say Victor and Indy, we do have something in English that is like that, but people just don't use it. So I think I agree with Victor that no one says that. Absolutely. Because no one, it's not really that important, honestly. It's only important in science. Like 1 meter intervals. For example, if you're doing like HIIT, like exercise, fitness, for example, it would be 1 count of meters and the type of thing, which are intervals. So you can have 2 meter intervals. Right? Meter will stay the same all the time, but you're counting up and you're asking what kind of counter it is for the type of thing you're doing, which are intervals. So when you're running in 1 mile intervals or 1 meter intervals, it's very helpful that you say, oh, I didn't just do 2 intervals of running, right? And it gets really confusing. Right? You have 2 intervals of running. Is it a length? Is it a time? What is it? What kind of intervals are they? Like time? So then you would insert hours or seconds. Length, right? And you will insert like miles or kilometers, right? And then it modifies the rest, which is whatever you're counting. So that's my best example. It's kind of a when you get to like high school science teacher wise, it's the one thing that science teachers get disappointed by all the time, where when a kid answers like, what is the distance between A and B, and then the kid answers, they like solve a math problem, right? It'll be a map like A and B, and it'll be C to C, and then I don't know, you do a triangle thing like 3, 4, and then this would be 5, right? And the kid would answer 5, literally 5, and this would be wrong. This would be marked off as wrong in science, because 5 what? So they would probably put like a unit here, and then it'd be a question mark here, and the kid would likely just say 5 instead of 5 miles. And that happens so often because English is not specific. It's just, you don't have to be specific. And I love Japanese and Mandarin because they're really specific. They're like that. At least that's my point yesterday that I was making. Like, there's so much specificity in the rules. You have to add certain words to make sure that no one gets anything confused. But the more rules, the harder to remember, in my opinion, or the more details you have to remember. And English, you don't need to. I don't think most people ever specify. What's up, Milo? What's up? Yeah, science. When you're doing science classes, everything has counts, or what I call units. Although I think, when you say 1 meter, can you guys help me out, Victor and Indy? If they say 1 meter, right? 1 meter, what does that look like in Japanese? Like 1 meter of rope. Like, is there a specific word that tells you it's a length, and then you modify rope with length, and then the number stays the same or something? I'm actually kind of curious. So do you need an extra word to tell you that it's a length of an object? 1, okay. Each. Unfortunately, I can't read. Wait. Each. Man, all that is kind of 1 meter. Oh, meter. Okay. Interesting. 1 meter. Meter. That's it? And then rope, right? 1 meter. Oh, you know what? Now that I think about it, of is not even in Japanese, huh? I don't even know if prepositions are in Japanese, or are they implied? I'm guessing they're probably implied. Of rope. It's not a good example. I think I might take it back. It might not actually be that great of an example, because I don't even know how you would say it in Japanese. I did 700 XP today. 500 was for the last leaderboard and 200 for this one. You feel like not good being, I learned a lot. Should I take a break? Take a break when you're tired, you know? Milo? If you're starting to find that your consistency is falling down, right? Or maybe your attention, your focus is declining, then those are pretty good telltale signs to take a rest. Usually no. Okay, no is of. I don't know the counter for rope, but to use something I do know. Interesting. Interesting. So each of these objects, right? Each of these objects may have different counters. Wait, then how many counters are there? You never read science text? Okay. How long has it... I'm kind of curious, Victor. How long has it been since you read, you know, like the front page? You know how like fitness is a big thing, right? And nutrition is a big thing. And oftentimes they would provide like, here's the hyperlink. Here's the hyperlink to like a front of the journal article. You'll probably see a lot of it where they use units. All the stuff. The reason, in my opinion, that science ends up being more precise writing often is because of the units, or what I would call adjectives. They're generally just adjectives for layman speak. Just adjectives. There's a different counter for everything. Oh. Wow. Okay, that's way more. I think having a different counter for everything, that's way more complicated than units, like English units. I'm not talking about like metric versus like in English units. I think that's having a counter, like a counter for everything. That's kind of that. I feel like there's gonna be more to remember than just remembering the appropriate units for things. I've never read Japanese articles of that stuff. Oh, I see. I get you. I got you. One is for cylindrical stuff, okay. And then one is used for round or oval stuff like eggs or balls. And one is used for counters for people. Yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean. So the closest thing I can say is units. When you use units in English. So oftentimes when we speak and talk, we don't ever use appropriate units to define anything. We just call them wholes. We assume they're whole things all the time. So you never... so instead of working with whole people, right? So English did a kanji move. This is my equivalent of kanji. So one, instead of saying one pair of people, nowadays we combine this and say either pairs, make pairs the unit, or couples, right? Couples. But the thing is, pairs of people aren't necessarily couples. So then you go with pairs. And that's how English has simplified the need to use pairs. But guess what? If you use one pairs, then you don't know if it's people or something else, like shoes, for example. Right? So this is where English falls apart all the time. It leads to misunderstanding. So it's not because we don't have it in English, in my opinion. Don't have counters. Don't have counters in English. It's just most of us don't use it anymore. Like, we don't use it in common things. We already know what we're counting. So when you say one person, you're always referring to one whole person. Hopefully. you're always referring to one whole person. It's implied. But the unit, the counter, is actually one whole person. Because you could definitely count half a person in math and stuff. Yeah, English is the same, in which you match the counters with whatever the question is. Yep. Imagine saying one pound of person. Like, if someone is inferring when they say one person, they're thinking, oh, 1 pound a person. Like, excuse me? We don't count pounds of people. We count whole people. although for real, in science, when you're measuring, right, when you're measuring something, it could be 1 pound of people. It's just, it'll be specified. So when you're measuring something, it'll be specified what type of measure you're doing, right? It's always the metrics. So if you're measuring total weight of people, there is a chance they would have to specify it's pounds of people, as opposed to like total weight of people, not total like individual people or singular people, which is really funny. This stuff is great. Not total volume. Yeah. So, oh dude, and then we have volume. So not even volume, right? So like one thing, a thing has all these dimensions, right? Volume, weight, I don't know. And if you want volume and weight together, density, and then count. And this is where I feel like most people get it. One count of a thing, right? One count of a thing. And it's implied that it's whole. It's a whole thing, whatever it is. And we default to this. This is the default. You're always counting one whole object of whatever the thing is. However, the object has volume, weight, density, length, right? Dimensions, just like different dimensions. Or grouping. So instead of count, different grouping of people. So a bunch of couples, or like 2 couples, 2 triplets, 2 quadruplets, 2 heads, 2 pairs of shoulders, right? That kind of thing. But no one ever sees that. We just assume the things that we are counting are understood all the time. 1 kg of meat, please. Yeah. Wait. I just imagined this funny. I can imagine a really funny skit, like, what? Like a construction worker. Say a construction worker. The skit would be this: here's a counter, and then there'll be meat, right? It's a butcher shop, and then there's a guy behind the counter, and then you have different people approach. It's like a construction worker. Can the construction worker say, "Can I have a 32 square meters?" No, that's a lot. 30 square centimeters of meat. And then you have, like, I don't know, an athlete, like a runner, come up and say, "Can I have 50 kilometers of meat?" That's a lot, actually. Like 5 kilometers of meat. Instead of just saying, so the casual, right? The casual just say 1 sirloin, please. or like 1 chicken breast, please. Right? So what they're assuming is that the butcher has already normalized the count. So the butcher has already normalized the count, as in a unit of meat. And this is where lies layman speak. So when in English, when you have a layman speak, you're always taking it to the one whole unit. One whole unit. So when people say, I got a hot dog, I got 1 hot dog, or 1 package of hot dogs, they already normalize it. 1 package of hot dogs doesn't tell you how many hot dogs, right? Because a package of hot dogs could have 8 or 10 sometimes, or even 6. So no one says like, I have 1 package of 6 hot dogs. It's just assumed that the unit is the singular count. And then when you go to order stuff, I'll have 1 order of spaghetti and meatballs, right? And it's just whatever the unit is. There's no we're just assuming that we already know what's in the spaghetti and meatballs. Maybe a couple meatballs, a couple pounds of spaghetti, pasta. So English just doesn't describe that. It just throws it out the window, and we don't need those anymore. It's so much fun. I love talking about this. Thank you again, Victor. Thank you. I love when people bring this stuff up. 1 gram of meat in Japanese, but that wouldn't use a counter. It would use no. Oh, interesting. So there are times you don't use counter. Is it because it's implied? Wait. Is it because it's implied? So 1 gram of meat, it's always just implied that, or like they'll always use the same weight, so you don't need to use a counter anymore for that stuff. Man, that's so interesting. I love these examples. These examples are great. One spaghetti and a meatball with 552 spaghettis. That's good. That's good, Milo. That's really good. Anyways, thank you. Thank you, guys. Always, seriously though, like, I interrupt me when you have a funny thought. I genuinely love talking about this stuff, because you really get into the mindset of how Japanese, like the culture is like. I still think just as a slight cut, right? Slight cut. I do not think it's common for people to use units ever in English, because it would take too much time. It's not efficient to use units. You never have to describe what you're counting. Like the numbers don't require units most of the time when we're talking in English. Generally, you just assume. You're assuming. You cut to the chase. And it's kind of the most, this stuff is considered the boring part of science. So a lot of times when people say, here's a little fun thing about why science can be misconstrued. Like some people say, like, you know, drinking wine, for example. Drinking wine can help heart health or something. But a lot of people would say, oh, some wine, or 1 wine a day, or something like that. But if you look in the journal, the journal, it would spend a heck of a long time defining what that is. Like the volume, the concentration. I didn't even talk about concentration. The concentration, the timing, Like, all that is super important. But what happens is when someone reads this journal, they're going to ballpark it. So, like, even when it translates to this, some people are like, 1 glass of wine a day. What is 1 glass? Are we talking like 200 mils? Like, what the heck? Like, how do you know you're drinking too much or too little? And a lot of times when people summarize this, they're summarizing something that also is a summary of an even more detailed thing. Journals are the result of long research, and these are averages too. A lot of times these numbers are averages, and you have to find out what those averages came from. Is it a bimodal distribution? Is it a normal distribution? That's where the science, when a lot of people talk about, oh, this is someone who's reading a journal article who doesn't participate in the field, is what happens when English breaks down. And it's, you know, most of the time this is kind of harmless. I kind of used the example that could be harmful, which is unfortunate, but most of the time information is not harmful when it's misinterpreted. You'll say 1 pound of beef at a butcher or something like that. People commonly buy their meats at a supermarket in America. Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's a great example. Independent. You just gave me another great example of when using counters in English is a good thing that you need to do. Metric versus English units. It gives away the appropriateness. So if you like go to Europe, right? If you go to Europe and you ask, can I have 10 pounds of meat? That could be a little bit problematic, right? 10 pounds of meat, that could be a little problematic. So it's not that big of a deal in my opinion. Like, what I mean by that is, but yeah, 4.5 kilograms. Yep, exactly. We talk about it a lot, like volumes. You know, what's 2 liters versus 2 gallons of stuff, right? Fahrenheit, Celsius. English requires unit modifiers for their numbers all the time. But I don't think it's as crazy as what you guys are saying, where you have to like make sure like you're counting round things or cylindrical things. I think it's more specific in Japanese for sure, because we're not taking into the consideration of characteristics of the things. The reason why the metric system was made in dimensions and stuff is so that you don't have to remember very more generalized things. So like you can measure a sphere by its total volume. So if you're gonna describe a sphere's quality, right? A sphere's quality, right? A sphere's quality, you could use volume instead. A form of volume, as opposed to needing to describe. Oh, you could use weight as well. So like how heavy the sphere is. So you would give a weight of the sphere. Something like that in common speak. So then people know. But again, most people would just say, I have 3 balls. That's it. It ends there. 3 balls. Are we talking about 3 man balls? Sorry, kids. Sorry. 3 man balls? then you would use the word testicles instead. And that would get closer. But then you have like big and small testicles. Sorry, kids. You know what I mean? Like, what kind of balls? 3 soccer balls? Oh no, then we have to get into football. 3 footballs? Yeah. So that's why English is I think it's cute. And like I like when it makes me smile when people argue about confusion, because English sucks at being specific. Like, English really does suck at being specific. It's awfully non-specific. Like, you could say like 3 people, right? 3 people. But it could be like 3 Asians. But are 3 Asians the same as 3 people? Not particularly. You could say 3 people and you really mean 3 dogs. You know, like, some people might think dogs are people. So when someone says, oh, no, I was referring to, like, have you ever gotten into a weird, awkward situation where it's saying like, oh yeah, my family, there are 3 people. Dogs. Have you ever gotten into an awkward situation where there are 3 people in my family, right? Right? There are 3 people in my family. I feel like a Japanese person would qualify that one of them is a dog. But when you talk in English, when someone says, I have 3 people in my family, and suddenly their names are Eve, like Carl, and then Buster. You're starting thinking, wait a minute. I'm assuming these are 3 people. But then later you find out this guy's a dog. So instead, I feel like Japanese people would say, I have 2 people and 1 dog, because they need counters. If you know what I mean. You know what I mean? Like, in their language, they will need separate counters for separate things. So it would stop them from grouping them together. So I don't know if there's a separate counter. It's just an example because I don't know enough Japanese or Mandarin. But you would say 2 people because it's a different counter. And then you would say like 1 dog because you need a different counter in the language, right? In that specific language. So it would force them to be more specific. And English, when you regular speak, you don't do that. You literally don't do that most of the time. You just group them all together. You group them as much as possible because it makes the English faster. It makes it shorter, like, you know. So people cut corners all the time. It's so laborious, in my opinion. In science, you have to love, one of the things, in my opinion, as a scientist, you have to love being specific in everything. And now you start to wonder why when you talk to someone in a higher education, right? They're always technical. Like, they're always so technical about things. Like, well, technically that is 2 individuals and 1 canine. The canine is not equivalent to the 2 people. And then when you're talking to a layman, you're saying, no, those are 3 people because that dog is part of my family. So my family, the English has officially count all the units in the household as individual wholes. While when you become technical, that's when things break apart, right? And I actually think that's brilliant. in my opinion. Like, I think it's brilliant, sort of, if your language for an extra word or like a easy thing, right? Like, instead of saying dog, you could add, I don't know, like a or an e at the end of an English word. Maybe that'll speed it up, right? Speed up the process. But generally speaking, I think that's kind of brilliant. Where when you're counting people, you'll know you're counting people. Like, you'll have enough context because you put a counter in front of people and then the number, right? And then the number, so they won't lump a counter of people versus a counter of plants. It sounds crazy. I needed something other than dogs because I don't know if dogs are considered different from people in Japanese or Mandarin. But when you count plants, you will most definitely not count them like people because of the unique word. I call them units, the unique units. And that's kind of cool. I think I'll look forward to that. It might be it's an extra detail that I agree with you. Most of the time, English doesn't do it. English does not count. You regularly don't consider having to count separate things. And that's the fun part, right? That's the funny part. That's where all the misunderstanding comes from too. English is not specific enough most of the time, even though we could use words to explain it by habit, but we don't have to. And that's so funny. How many times have you gotten into an argument about, well, how many Japans are in one United States? Like, no one asks these types of questions. You don't use counts with their actual physical description. Like, how many Japans can you fit in the United States? No one asks questions like that. I don't even know the answer to that. You would have to at least look up the surface area of Japan and then put it into the US's surface area. What we usually say is Japan is smaller than the United States. So there are more than one Japan in the United States. Look up the GDP. Exactly. Oh my gosh, Victor. I love this. You guys, that's so good. You look up the GDP because what are you talking about? What is English talking about? How many Japans? How many Japanese GDP? How many Japanese GDP are in the GDP of the USA? The English doesn't specify any of that. Now I have a question for you, both Victor and Indy. When you ask a question, it's the same, right? So when you ask a question in Japanese, since I know like deska, right, adding ka and stuff, they still use counts, right? So when you ask a question, you'll still have to use the counters to ask the question. So there's no misunderstanding, right? If you ask how many people are in, I don't know, the stadium, right? You're gonna have to need a counter here, right? To ask how many whole people are in the stadium. Because a technical person would be like a smart aleck. Like, if you meet a smart aleck person, you would say, well, technically, no, just the answers. Oh, interesting. I've heard a joke saying I have 4 kids, my husband, my dog, my cat, and my 9-year-old. Exactly. So here's let's settle on this. I love this topic. We'll use this as the deep digression for today. So technically, how many people are in the stadium, right? So if you get a technical person, they're going to say a specific number of adults, a specific number of kids, and a specific number of pets. And then what they would say is, okay, well, kids are between the ages of 18 or lower, and then adults are 18 plus, right? But then English doesn't say, well, the number of adults and the number of old people. So at least you get more detail, in my opinion, when you're doing the other way. But I don't know if so Indie says you don't use counters. So this example, I think both Japanese and English is probably going to have the same problems. Where, what do you mean how many people? Like, what kind of people are you talking about? Are you talking about if you count living things, right? If you count living things, then this would just be one number. Like, say there are 30 people in the stadium or 300 people in the stadium at the moment. That would include anything that's living or not even pets. It only includes adults and kids, like 300 humans. Kanji is specific enough so you don't get confused, I think. Okay, yeah, see what I mean? I like that. I think that's pretty sweet. That is, oh, is that how you say it in German? How many people are in the stadium? Wait, does stadium come out as stadium in German? Milo? So, I think it is what it is, but for sure, it's a great reflection of culture. I think the whole idea of forcing people to use counters and being more specific with their language, right, is reflective of the culture it comes from. And I totally understand that Japanese totally has more specific counters and stuff like that. It removes, it again removes a lot more confusion. It removes a lot more confusion, while English is loosey-goosey. Loosey-goosey. Like, it's loose, it's flexible, right? Some people use the word mess, and I said this before. It's the charm of English. It's messy. That's why people can use it more easily, because it's messy. Or less so, and it reflects the culture. And what I mean by it reflects the culture is that, what culture are we talking about? Are we talking about the United States? Well, the United States is not the reflection of one culture. English is the reflection of everyone that uses it, right? And English is messy because of that. Like, as much as I want to be ethnocentric, right? Like egocentric about the United States, it's really not that. It's everyone has loose usage of English. And I think Japanese is still a bit Japanese-centric because the rules are super enforced. Because the design of the language is restrictive. So you get a lot of the feeling of the Japanese culture through the language. When you're learning English, it's just a mess. Like, what kind of English are you learning from? If you spend your life growing up with the metric system, you're going to be hard pressed to understand what people are talking about when they use the English system. Ironically, it's a terrible choice of words and example, but the English measuring system and the metric system, ironically, I know how that's a confusing use of the word English, but in this case, we're not talking about the English as a language, but English as a system of measure. Yeah. Hey, AnimeX, what's up? AnimeX is from YouTube. Did you watch Howl's Moving Castle, by the way? I imagine you're here to tell me about what your thoughts are on Howl's Moving Castle. Because it would be something like, in the stadium, the people, what is the count? Oh, okay. I struggled with English in elementary school. I haven't asked. What was the order of your language, independent? When did you pick up the different languages? Was English your first? English was actually my second, but we basically cold turkeyed Mandarin. You're an English native? I see. Elementary school. I don't remember what we learned in elementary school. You picked up Japanese when you were 25 years old? Good for you, man. Good for you. Here's the thing. You want to know some crazy statistics? Actually, these aren't real statistics, because I don't know any of these statistics. But ballparking, just to celebrate something. With every year past like 18, there's like an exponential, I would say, an exponential drop in new language acquisition, in my opinion. So you being 25, hear me out here. It makes you a weirdo. There it is. I said it. I said it. Anyone who picks up a language after 18, you're a weirdo. Whoever want to do that? Seriousness though, it's awesome. This is an awesome achievement. It is an awesome achievement. Like, statistically, it falls off. Like, it falls off exponentially. With every passing year, people who acquire new language, it falls off. Incredibly hard. And that's why it's awesome to have communities who are still excited about learning new languages. English native that got placed in an ESL class. Wait, are you saying you did, Victor? I think someone asked me this yesterday. Okay. And I had the opposite effect. So, I think someone asked me yesterday when I was talking about English proficiency, what was my English like in high school? Oh, Victor, you did. Oh, no, wait, was who? No, someone, sorry, I'm reading ahead. Someone asked me what was it like in high school, and for me it was different. Unfortunately, I can't necessarily resonate with you, but I know other people around me that are incredible English speakers who started, like, it took a bit to connect with the language. But for me, just a long story short, this was the reason why I was considered gifted until college. And then I became then everyone caught up with me, basically. Like, I was gifted because of my language proficiency, and then I stopped developing my language proficiency, and then everyone caught up in college. That's how I feel about it, at least. Like, the people around me basically sounded very similar to me, and then it was a small fish, like, not a small fish, a big fish in a small pond situation where, oh yeah, this person has a great command of a language ahead of their peers, right? Because that's what those like IQ evaluations are. However, by the time I went to college and so on, language is pretty much normalized. If you continue to learn, right, you get diminished returns. You get diminished returns as you're approaching, I don't know, mastery of some sort. And eventually all the other people catches up. Like, relatively speaking. Relatively speaking. So that's kind of... And now we're still learning. You know, we're still learning. I can't wait to do counters. I don't know, Indy, did you do counters yet? Do you learn about counters in Duolingo? I kind of doubt it. This seems like a subtle thing, but maybe you do. Or did you learn that elsewhere? Because you picked up that language when you were 25, so I imagine... I guess it depends on what age you are now. You learn about it randomly. Okay, okay. Well, there you have it. There you have it. If I had to say anything, the hot take from our little digression here is that English, we say less because we can. And in my opinion, Japanese, you say what... Oh, I totally... You say what... You say what you need to say. In my opinion. That's the hot take. Because counters, in my opinion, are optional in English. Japanese, not so much. Not so much. Definitely not so much. Only in specialized cases that you cannot... It's unacceptable. Specialized cases. And the only reason I say this is because by coincidence. This is only coincidence. I doubt if you talk to anyone else, they would totally agree with you. It's just by coincidence that I worked in a field that this type of language is necessary. Because you would sound very, very silly if you do not use units. It actually shows that you're incompetent. So when you start throwing like 16 jars, if you start throwing around like 16 jars of vaccines or 16 jars of protein, like 10 bottles of bacteria, then you're going to be laughed out of the field. You cannot use counts without units. Like, you cannot use numbers without counters, the type of counter it is. Otherwise, you're not demonstrating that you actually understand what you're counting. If you don't understand what you're counting, then it throws question to your methodology. So how you perform your methods and protocols would come into question, and it would destroy your credibility, more or less. Basically, you got placed in ESL for my state because the primary language spoken at home was not English. Understandable. But my parents were using broken English and I was watching a lot of English television. I see. Also, you can usually tell if someone is an English speaker, is native or not, is if they use contractions or not. Independent. I know. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you about contractions. And I'm gonna tell you now, at the higher level of like scientific writing or like professional writing that doesn't deal with creativity, usually you want to avoid contractions. But I know exactly what you mean. You're talking about contractions in speech. You're talking about contractions in speech. When people are talking to each other, contractions occur. I'm going to tell you now, there's a chance when you hear me use a contraction, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. Largely because I actually do avoid using contractions. Now, there's a really great use of contractions to feel homely and casual. And I don't know if you noticed this in video games, but I play a game called Like a Dragon, right? And the way they separate Kansai, so the Kansai dialect from the Kanto dialect, is that when they translate the localization of the English, the Kansai dialect has more contractions. And the Kanto do not. And oftentimes contraction means you're rustic. Rustic, uncouth a little bit, like unrefined. And this is more, metropolitan, sophisticated, I guess. And that's how they separated the two. And generally this dichotomy is used in writing as well when it comes to not the creative arts. So if you're flamboyantly doing that, usually the creative arts, when you look at writing, like authors, so really the developers convert Kansai to British English. No. So well, actually it's kind of like that. So imagine if Kanto spoke British English. Actually, it would be the other way around. Kanto would speak British English and Kansai would speak American English. It's that type of relationship. Americans or American English tend to, when you speak and try to be grounded, when you're being grounded, Americans tend to use a lot of contractions. So that ain't it, Chief. Like, I do that a lot to ground myself. So when I talk to people, if you don't want to sound too formal, right? Like Japanese people, you don't want to sound too formal, at least the Kanto Japanese people. You don't want to sound too formal. You don't put chas, don't ya, what's that? How's it going? I actually don't say that a lot. I usually say, how is it going? Or how, I don't use contractions, even in speech a lot of times. And funny enough, one of the core reasons, like one of the core feelings of why someone is a little bit more well-spoken than homely, as in like intellectual, that whole like, besides filler words, the use of filler words, if you add a lot more contractions into your English, it makes you feel homely and welcoming. It also reduces the intellectual barrier. So when you start adding things like, I can't do that, that's not it. I can't do it really well. Yeah, I can't do it really well, so that's a problem. So I can't even pretend to add. Where would you add? That ain't it, Chief. That is not it. Yeah, literally, I would say, to emphasize, I would say that is definitely not it for me. So I would add a lot of adverbs, and I would add adverbs in between where contractions would be. So this is unacceptable. This is absolutely unacceptable. Instead of this, like, people skip helping verbs a lot because of contractions. I can't even do it naturally. So it's really funny that you brought that up. I really love that you brought that up, the whole native speaker. And I totally agree with you. The vast majority of people would use contractions. And I don't know, do contractions exist in Japanese? Where you combine, because in this game, in this Like a Dragon series, right? I keep hearing the ya at the end. So in Kansai, oh, it's only in English? You know how the accent? So I played lots of Like a Dragon games. I played all of them, basically. And I spent so much time because they made a really big deal because the Osaka, you know, the difference between Kansai and Kanto. I don't know if you guys already know this, but the whole city life versus the countryside, or like kind of the more rustic versus the more refined, you can hear their accent. And in this game series, they deliberately made the Japanese voice actors speak with a specific accent, so you can definitely tell when someone's from a Kansai region and someone who's from the Kanto region. And it struck me, even though I didn't know any of the Japanese, it struck me immediately as, oh yeah, that's like a southern twang. Like in English, when you hear a southern twang, you will immediately be able to differentiate between someone. And it's not just the contractions, but when you head down into countryside, the casual speak actually increases the frequency of use of contractions. And when you get not necessarily north, I think north people still continue to use contractions. It's just less frequent, right? Like it's just less frequent, right? I just said it is, right? It is just less frequent. It's less frequent, right? I don't know. It's kind of funny. Contractions are funny. No contractions, but there's formal and informal speech levels. Yeah. I think that's kind of how that works. The closest thing to this whole contraction thing in Japanese is the formal and informal speech. That's the closest English has in denoting when you add lots of contractions. And then the other thing is probably ano. You know, things like interjections. Soka. Or so, or I guess so or soka. I don't know how it goes, but like OIC, right? When I met someone, I have only met a Japanese scientist 2 or 3 times in my life, and they replaced their like interjections in Japanese with actual English phrases, and one of them is OIC. And I do this quite a lot. OIC. My parents do this ne, or ne, lots of nes, and or the and then. So when they speak something, they're like, oh, this is this and this and this, nah. This and this and this, nah. This is this and this, nah. Just add la to everything. Yeah, exactly. So just keep adding, and I feel those are similar to contractions, right? What happens is it reduces the formalness and the informalness. And I think that's what Japanese and English can relate to each other. Even though contractions might be unique, the feeling is still the same. The feeling is very similar when they when they transfer these things. There are elements. Contractions are not necessary. See, I just did that. Did you hear what I just said? I said contractions are not necessary. Or I could have said aren't. Contractions aren't necessary to speak in English, but it feels very, very uncomfortable. So I typically say I cannot encourage you to do this. It's not I can't encourage you to do this. I usually don't use can't unless I'm in an incredibly informal situation, like when I'm with friends or something, even streaming actually. So I add more contractions when I'm streaming and playing video games and trying to sound a little bit grounded. When I'm speaking to a classroom of students, I generally avoid contractions. I don't know why that's the case. See, I just said don't, right? I don't know why, as opposed to I do not know why that's the case. However, I probably would say do not, for some emphasis on the not. So do not misunderstand me. Not don't understand me, misunderstand me. And that's a double negative, which is also an informal thing. If you want to pick up a person who's ironically a native speaker, this is an American thing. I'm not sure if it's a British thing. I haven't been around British people. However, American English, one of the most iconic high frequency use are double negatives. Like, don't make a mistake, or don't, like, the negation of a negative word. So don't make a mistake. So do it right. That happens as an emphasis. So double negatives is a enhanced emphasis. So if you ever want to confuse the heck, yeah. But in English, it's confusing. But a native English speaker, especially an American, would do negations and confuse the heck out of people. In my opinion. I actually think when someone is starting out and they need to learn English, they will constantly use the affirmative before they understand what's the point of using a double negative. Like, it's a nuance that is so second nature to American speakers. It's always the same. I have tons of foreign people ask to explain what contractions are and how do they use them. I've always the same thing. You've always said the same thing, and yeah. Milo, most languages are unique. They are also similar in many ways too. Yep. So we're celebrating the similarities and the differences. How would you feel about adding a contraction counter? A contraction counter. On the topic you're talking about, ne is Japanese add a more passive voice that you usually hear from females. Oh, interesting. Are you calling me a female? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, just kidding. Double negatives are, yeah, I understand. In English, it would be something like, you like this shirt, right? The right at the end is the ne, yeah. Yep, ne. Yep. And my parents do it all the time. In English. Even though they're not Japanese, by the way. They just add an extra thing. Most of the time, I think the stereotype, the cliche thing is and then. And then is the Americanized like the Chinese American ne. Oftentimes when my father is trying to convey an idea and he's not done, he says and then. Sometimes it's ne, and then it just keeps going. Not done yet. And sometimes he would just go ne. And he is done. That's where the confusion happens too. The person would think, can is I'm still waiting for the rest. And that's kind of funny. It reminds me of like younger people. So younger people who speak, they speak with an uptone, and it just feels that there's more. You know, that there's more going on. See, I could have used contraction there. I could have said that there's more. That there's more. But I prefer to say that there is more. It might sound, eventually if you say it fast enough, it might sound like that there's more. As in, you don't immediately say the there is anymore, right? I feel like it's kind of like learning about shka or ski or ski, right? Where most of the time English would be suki. So you just start with suki. At some point, if they say suki long enough, they would contract it and say ski instead. That's my only example at the moment of what English contraction feels like when you become a native English speaker. Your words slap together. So theirs is just a shortened version of there is. You didn't hear the start of this conversation? Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I was trying to illustrate what is the closest feeling. Ski is a dialect in Tokyo. Like the way ski is pronounced. The conversation that I was saying, Indie, was if you say there is a ton of times. Yeah, Duolingo teaches you to speak like Kanto. Okay, so this is the Kanto pronunciation. Yeah. So the Kanto dialect. Yeah. So I'm used to hearing ski, right? That's kind of like what I mean by contractions. There are regional differences in contractions. Even though when you say a lot, you just get used to it. Like there is. There's, I sometimes say there is. Or I sometimes say there's. Like there's something wrong with this. Oftentimes though I don't say it. I often just say there is something wrong. There is something very wrong. It could, if you're too slow, if someone is learning English and you hear me say there is something wrong, it might end up sounding like there's something wrong. It's just really fast. It's kind of like saying bok, des, ski. The more you say it, the more it gets closer and closer together in English, and I feel that's why contractions happen for native English speakers. They're saving time, saving lots of time, right? Anyways, thank you again for sharing, guys. I really thought I was gonna focus without digressing today, but it's nice to always make more memories while you're learning. Taksan, yeah, taksan with a short ku when it sounds like a singular K. Yep, taksan. I would say taksan. I listen to when I play video games, especially Japanese ones. So many of them, the vast majority of the speakers, I would say greater than 90, has the Kanto dialect. And then occasionally in Duolingo, I hear a different pronunciation. I'm like, that's interesting. And taksan would be one of them. Or yaksa. Because I played Like a Dragon, right? Because I played Like a Dragon, it used to be called yaksa. in the Western world. Like those titles are still being called yakuza, but I've since been so used to hearing yakuza as opposed to yakuza, which is fine. Yakuza. It's not yakuza, right? The English, the keikona is the yakuza. Yakuza, where the accent is on here. But then it's the yakuza. Yakuza. And over time, after like 1 year-ish of listening to Kanto people in the game, I say yakuza. The U is almost practically silent, right? Yakuza. And I totally noticed that. And now doing Duolingo, I'm like kind of unlearning that a little bit, or being a little bit more flexible. So I don't know when I'm being a little bit weird or not. Like, so when I say boke, I want to say boke, but oftentimes I think it's like boku, just a lighter U. And then when they say boke, I'm like, oh, okay. Like, for example, roku, doku, right? Doku? Yeah, watashi. Yeah, watash. Yeah, watash. Yes. Or anything with like a E before another, like shmi, shmi. Like this is not a good example. Like shita, right? Shita, right? That's not a good example. I would go back and forth. Like shimi, but this is like shita, right? It's like shta. And this is what I mean by contraction, in my opinion. I think this would be the closest way to tell a Japanese person why native English speakers eventually sound like they're contracting together. When you start thinking of it in this manner, where like shita, right? Shita, 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 shta. That's like there is, there's. There is, there's. So it becomes theirs as opposed to there is. And sometimes I don't even recognize if I'm saying there is versus theirs. And I naturally do that here too. After listening to video games for so long, this stuff comes up a lot. And I'm not sure if you could say just shita instead of shta. So many fun things. All right. We've digressed enough. Okay. Where were we? Oh yeah, right. I know where we are. I need to go to the bathroom. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Hola, es increíble como se aprende aquí. Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, we try to be as consistent as possible. Well, at least I try to be consistent as possible. Thanks. I try. Welcome, welcome. This is how you say a word. This is how you say a word, actually, man. Is Ita, and it's said like that. Same with for deer. I suppose. I don't really know right now, Indy. I don't have enough knowledge to know if I'm saying it correct or not. I'm imitating. At the moment, words are still at the point of imitation. Because here's a point, right? I'm concerned that first of all, I have another thought before we go into that. Just a little bit. Just as another deep cut for next time. The word accent versus dialect. Right? So I'm not entirely so when we talk about Kanto and Kansai, I almost feel like the difference between these two are somewhere in the middle between accent and dialect. So oftentimes I am constantly wondering if I'm becoming more unintelligible versus this is style. And what I mean by that is in my use of the word these English words, right? Accent is referring to the speech pattern that you have, but it's intelligible. Intelligible, but stylistic. When it becomes a dialect, when something becomes more towards a dialect, it becomes unintelligible. So for example, the reason why I use this distinction is because Fujonese, or what I would use is Fujianese, but apparently there's a distinction there too. Fujonese is unintelligible. Unintelligible to Mandarin. And because Fujianese is unintelligible to Mandarin, it's considered a dialect. So now here's where I worry. If I'm constantly hearing Kansai and Kanto, am I becoming more unintelligible to each other? And I don't think I get that impression. I don't think I get that impression of if I said katsudon, right? Katsudon. Right? If I'm pronouncing katsudon, I wouldn't get mixed up. Even though clearly katsudon is one accent versus the other. So in my opinion, sometimes it's a little confusing if when people say, is it the Kanto dialect and the Kansai dialect, or is it a Kanto accent and a Kansai accent? Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So Indy, that's the problem, right? That's the problem. I don't know what is different and what isn't yet because I don't know enough Japanese. So it's going to be a fun thing to discover in the future, where what are words that are accented differently, like an accent, and what words are just, it's unintelligible. Because there's the other one, like in Hokkaido and Sapporo, like specifically Sapporo, it's called, what is it, like I forgot what they're saying. All this is important because in Like a Dragon series, they talked about at least 3 regional dialects. And the characters that they have actually spoke in those 3 regional dialects. And there was one game in the series that a quarter of it took place in Sapporo, or more Hokkaido, like in the Sapporo region, right? So, and then there was one in that same game, there was a Kyushu area where they had a distinctive dialect too. And to me, it still just sounds like Japanese, but in the game, they specifically denote that those dialects are very strong and noticeable. And that's that's why most of the time in games, they're separated by British and Americans. Yes. But we have to remember that the relationship between British and American is vocabulary, but not a dialect, right? So we have British accents and American accents. The words that separate the use is still intelligible by Americans. They're just infrequent. So like the Lu, that's just a separate word. It's not a dialect of the same word that separates the understanding. An American will understand what the Lu is, like just the fun things that I don't know British English that much, like the British specific vocabulary enough to give you better examples instead of pop culture examples. But the Lu, the water closet, that stuff, those are still intelligible in a way. Like you can imitate those. Yeah, Lu is slang, right? So slang is still technically part of an accent. It's not necessarily unintelligible in the sense that it's just out there. But it's always a duality here. Like how unintelligible it is gets closer and closer to a dialect. That's one of my thoughts earlier, but I still don't know the relationship between Kanto and Kansai. I mean, like rubber in British English is eraser in American. Yes. But you can also still say rubber or eraser as an American. The hard part here is American. What is American? that's a problem. That's probably a problem there. Perhaps we'll just say it's a unique case and we'll call it a day for now. I know, but American English, when you're comparing American English with British English, you're doing the same thing. You're still doing the same thing. Because my English might sound American English, but I use different... There are other terms that I use that would be considered part of American English, but it's underrepresented. And here's what I mean by that. When you think of examples in British English, a lot of the examples that differentiate these two might be underrepresented. Slang technically is an underrepresentation too, right? It's a tough one. We'll have to talk about English another time though. This is about Japanese. This is about Japanese though. Okay. I'm never gonna finish this yet.